Hey, what's up, guys? Comic Book Creator. This is one of those two Miles publications. The other one's being Back Issue and Alter Ego. This one obviously usually has a very long interview with a creator, dude. Kind of like the old Comics Journal, if you remember that back in the day. This one in particular, Stephen Bissette, obviously, most famous for being the artist in the 80s on Swamp Thing. Alan Moore had joined when he had been doing issues before. Issues I remember, Alan Moore jumped on, and I remember reading the first issue of it and not understanding it and stopped reading Swamp Thing. I was a little kid, so Alan Moore was maybe maybe a little over my head at the time. Uh, the interview is interesting. Essentially, the right off the bat when there he is, right? Right off the bat when they describe what the interview is going to be, they mention that they're not going to mention Swamp Thing much, which is fine, right? I mean, we all know what he's about. Look at that artwork, though. This is an example of Stephen Bissette's artwork. Of course, he was one of the, I think, the first class, the graduating class of the Joe Kubert School, if you remember Joe Kubert. Now, it's funny, it's right off the bat, we're going to get into some boomerisms, but just, it's interesting, right? He's a Vermont born and raised, right? Even though things are swinging further and further extreme right. Okay. Even though we have a Republican governor, we almost always have a Republican governor. He's handled the pandemic with relative sanity. Oh, ooh, ooh. Wait a minute there. The most hardcore governors with that stuff, where I wouldn't say things are swinging to the extreme. Anyway, what's the point? And the little things here too. The guy is nuanced. The guy is interesting. He goes, Santa Fe, right? He loved New Mexico, which I also love. New Mexico, one of the most beautiful states in this country. You want to do art? If I've been painting cowboys, horses, landscapers, cattle skulls, or Native American girls in the nude, I probably made a go of it in the New Mexican art scene, but it's changed a lot. That's no longer a correct thing. I just thought that was funny. Essentially, it's cool. It's interesting the interview going through it. The first guys at the Joe Kubert School, how they all kind of roomed in a house to pay the rent, and how the work was very hard to come by. Apparently, even though Joe Kubert worked for DC and did a lot of amazing art and for him, they seem to be blacklisting his students. Very interesting. And also, I like how he goes. There were no horror comics at the time. They had the mystery books, right? Because that was still a carryover from the code. These weren't horror; these were mystery. Yeah. But it's interesting at the history of it, how they had problems, and eventually they got their feet in the door. One big theme of this interview is the difficulty of getting paid, the difficulty of contracting, the difficulty of Stephen got screwed a lot. So did even Joe. He mentions these French editions of Enemy Ace and Firehair, if you know who Firehair is in French, and Joe doesn't get 1 red cent for it. So he was always big on trying to make sure he and his compatriots got paid. Okay, a lot of negative stuff in the comic industry, in terms of getting the people paid, right? And Steven became like a big advocate of that, particularly in the '80s, the whole Jack Kirby thing and the Joe Simon and Schuster sort of thing. Interesting, even they got screwed, huh? But what's fascinating was that throughout the whole time, Steven even says, I wasn't really into superheroes. I wanted to do horror. Right? And eventually he got his chance, okay? When they left Swamp Thing. I remember this. I remember seeing this in the comic store. I remember saving money up to buy this, okay? This was the late 80s, 88. Yours truly is very cool, very much into goth, very much into horror movies, very much into like Clive Barker, even Stephen King to a degree. I know. And they made this, and it was interesting here. This guy here, David Sim, right? David Sim, the guy Cerebus. I remember when I first started seeing comics that were independent. This was a big deal, and this guy made a lot of money, just like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle guys made a lot of money. It was hard to find these comics, so he helped to publish this first one. And apparently, this guy is really considered. He's been canceled for something. I don't know what, but Steve's loyal to him. Steve says whatever the problems people have with him, David Sim kept his word. And so going through the whole key, right, was that he was into horror. He wanted to get the horror comics out of the EC, pre-code model of like these kind of things. I mean, this is like some underground comic making kind of fun of those old comics. But he wanted to take the horror comics out of the old 50s template. And he wanted to go into like the modern horror, which is to say, the stuff from the 70s and the 80s, George Romero, right, Joe Dante, David Cronenberg, and this is Taboo, right? I remember horror anthology, man. This was cutting edge horror. I remember Wasteland from DC, but this was like, man, Fly in My Eye. That was another one. I was all into that stuff, and I can get my hands on it. And then we got the boomer generation. Must be not. You have no idea what country you were born into. You have no idea what country I'm gonna be going into. But a little funny thing here. I don't mean to pick apart anything. So I guess we were torturing people by then. He's talking about the Iraq War. I mean, your generation grew up. Torture was bad, right? And now we do it. Let me tell you something, Steve. Americans were torturing people, way before that. Just so you. But regardless, okay. Great interview, man. Very interesting. The whole goal trying to get the comics into modern horror, which they did. These guys are great. Remember, From Hell. Right? Alan Moore did a lot of work with Alan Moore. Obviously, from Swamp Thing, they did a lot of work together later. From Hell became a movie eventually. That was started with Taboo. And unfortunately, him and Alan Moore had a huge falling out in relation to the most money they ever made, which was this thing. Do you remember this? I remember this from Image Comics. Like this kind of pseudo Marvel, golden, a Silver Age, I guess, comic retelling. They made so much money from this that they were able to fund other things. And I remember that Godzilla. He drew that Godzilla from Dark Horse, that one shot. He also talks about the problems they had, the Night of the Living Dead action, Fantico, right? Gore Shriek. My Goreheads remember that. And that they were slated to do Rawhead Rex. Okay, remember the books of remember these covers? They took a latex mask, like a Halloween mask, put some light behind it, and put like rubber fishing worms and lures in it. And that was the cover for this American edition of the Books of Blood. But yeah, they had the rights. They were going to do a Rawhead Rex comic. Steve Niles apparently had the rights, 19-year-old Steve Niles, but it didn't happen. Okay, and you see a lot of that. You see that the guy struggled a lot. And he brings up the whole thing with money, the whole thing with copyright, the whole thing with waiting forever. I mean, this cool stuff. The fact that Eclipse Comics, the fact that the woman, the editor, Kat Jan Road, hated horror. She was philosophically opposed to it as a genre. Who the hell is philosophically opposed to horror? It's like saying I'm the only thing I'm philosophically opposed to is country music. Oh. Anyway, just wrapping it up here. He's still doing this. Look at his friggin' art, dude. All things aside, man. The art. Look at the art, man. This is him, bro. This comic here, Tyrant, about the birth, life, and death of a Tyrannosaur. Look at that. Amazing. And there's so much more. There's so much more stuff going in here that I can go to. I can't get to everything here, but very fascinating look at the industry from the past 40 years. And also the debacle when Diamond became the only publisher. Right? I like how he makes a point here, right? Spider Baby Graphics was his company. When you go from 12 distributors to one distributor in the space of a few months, Well, that forced out all the little guys and the medium-sized guys. Remember that? Marvel thought they were going to do it all. And then Diamond now is the only dude left. They're setting up the world you have now. Yeah, it was great. It was pretty good. He's retired now. I assume he still works on his own projects. I like how he pointed out in The Witch that the nails they were using were from the hardware store. Man, good job. Now you're saying, how is he so good at checking this out from a movie? Well, Stephen Bissette, I also remember seeing him when I wasn't really looking at the old comics too much. He is also a writer. He writes about horror movies. He's a horror cinema journalist and expert. And I'll show you probably the place where he wrote a lot of stuff. Over these monster. These are Create Space kind of horror fans. This is one of the best horror fanzines, you want to call it. Very professional, tons of information, and many of them frequently. I think the publisher, what is it? Timothy Paxton. Frequently, they figured a very large involved article by Mr. Bissette. Okay, remember this? Invasion of the Animal People. Right? This one, he goes over fungus and horror, right? The Derelict, I went over that. Matango, tried to show you that. What is this? He even wanted to put some kind of Matango thing in Swamp Thing, but the editor wouldn't let him. And Lovecraft's funny from young off. So he'll go into a lot of interesting things. He doesn't do like a short article. He does a really in-depth article on a lot of stuff here. The Dumb Witch Horror. This is a great article on a very underrated movie. I remember seeing this freaking me out. Apparently, there was an album of this that was released, of the music. That's fascinating. I didn't know that until I read Mr. Bissette's article. What other stuff you got here? Something about a one of the scariest horror stories. Now he's talking about comics, because he's also an expert on horror comics. Dell Comics made this story that was, he thinks, one of the best horror stories ever. The Monster of Dread Ed. Now remember, Dell never assigned the comics code. Apparently, this story is about this giant claw thing. Look at that. He goes into this huge thing about this one comic, of course, with all the historical setup. And giant behemoth. Yes, giant behemoth is a redundant term. Dude, the giant behemoth is great, man. That's a great stop motion. Always stick up for stop motion. Yeah, that was a good movie. And Mr. Bissette goes in that. Very good writer. A lot of stuff I found out from him that I didn't know. Like why they call it Godzilla vs. the Thing instead of Godzilla, Mothra vs. Godzilla in the American version. Anyway, more, Stephen Bissette, man, good dude, amazing artist, great writer, cool guy, very interesting interview.